They told the world he died peacefully, surrounded by love, they said. 5 children at his bedside, holding his hands as the great Bruce Allpress, the man who rode with Rohan, who graced New Zealand screens for 6 decades, took his final breath on April 23, 2020. But whispers from those close to the family tell a different story. According to sources who spoke on condition of anonymity, something changed in the 7 days before that peaceful death. Some claim medical charts were reviewed not once, but 3 times in those final days. Not just by doctors, but by lawyers too. One former neighbor insists a neurologist made urgent calls to family members, warning about cognitive decline that had accelerated suddenly within a single week. And in that same week, rumors suggest a document appeared. A document that allegedly rewrote everything his children thought they knew about their father's wishes. Who brought that document to his bedside, if the stories are true? Why was it never mentioned in public tributes? And what did it say about the man who had always promised to treat his 5 children equally? According to some reports that circulated after his death, his final illness may have been amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, though the family's official statement mentioned only that he had battled illness with courage. If it was ALS, it's a cruel disease that strips the body of its power, while in theory leaving the mind intact. And if the whispers are true, he'd been fighting it since late 2018. At first, friends from the Takapuna Repertory Theater remember him joking about his trembling hands, telling them he finally had an excuse to forget his lines. But ALS, if that's what it was, is no comedy. It's a slow execution. The muscles weaken, the voice fades. Eventually, even breathing becomes a conscious battle. What the public tributes never mentioned was how the disease had allegedly progressed in those final months. People who claimed to have visited the Allpress home on Auckland's North Shore during the first weeks of April 2020 described a man who was barely recognizable. Not physically, though his body had withered dramatically, but mentally. Bruce, who had memorized Shakespeare and Shaw, who could recite entire radio plays from the 1950s, had reportedly begun to lose words. Simple words. According to one visitor, he would point at a glass of water, and the words simply wouldn't come. Here's what makes this tragic story even darker, if the accounts are accurate. ALS doesn't typically affect cognitive function. The mind should stay sharp, even as the body betrays it. So when Bruce allegedly began showing signs of confusion, of memory loss, of sudden emotional outbursts that were utterly unlike his gentle nature, some family members reportedly suspected something else was happening. Was it a secondary diagnosis the doctors had missed? Was it the heavy medication for pain and anxiety? Or, and this is the question that allegedly still haunts at least 2 of his children, was someone deliberately keeping him sedated, foggy, unable to understand what he was signing? Because according to Neighborhood Talk, Bruce Allpress signed something in those final days. Multiple sources claim to remember it. A lawyer visited the house around mid-April, less than a week before Bruce's death. The visit was brief, private. When the man left, some say he was carrying a folder that hadn't been in his hands when he arrived. The children were allegedly not all present for this visit. According to neighbors who spoke on condition of anonymity, only 2 of the 5 were in the house that afternoon. 2 out of 5. The others, including his eldest daughter Susan and his youngest son Peter, were reportedly not informed until later that legal business had been conducted. Not informed until after their father could no longer speak at all, or so the story goes. What was in that folder, if it existed? What did Bruce sign while his mind was allegedly clouded by disease and morphine? And why did the 2 children who were supposedly present that day refuse to discuss it with their siblings, if any of this is true? In New Zealand, a will can be challenged if there's evidence the deceased lacked mental capacity at the time of signing. It can also be challenged if there's evidence of undue influence, if someone in a position of power over a vulnerable person manipulated them into changing their wishes. Bruce Allpress, in April 2020, was about as vulnerable as a human being can be. He couldn't walk. He couldn't feed himself. He communicated mostly through blinks and slight nods, according to those who saw him. And yet someone thought it was appropriate, necessary even, to bring legal documents to his bed,
if the rumors are to be believed.
The family released a beautiful statement after his death. They spoke of his courage, his artistry, his devotion to New Zealand theater. They mentioned his pride in all his children, his joy in his grandchildren. They thanked the staff at Hospice North Shore. Bruce never spent a night in hospital. He died at home, in his own bed, as he'd always wished. What they didn't mention was the growing silence between some of the siblings, according to family friends. The phone calls that allegedly went unreturned. The funeral where 2 of the 5 children barely spoke to each other, or so witnesses claim. One of those children was Michael Allpress, the coffee entrepreneur, whose company, Allpress Espresso, had grown from a single cart in Auckland to an international brand with roasteries in London and Tokyo. Bruce had been Michael's first investor when the coffee dream began. Some say as early as the mid-'80s, others point to '89 when the first cart appeared. That investment, modest at the time, perhaps 20,000 New Zealand dollars, according to business associates, had multiplied many times over. By 2020, Allpress Espresso was valued in the tens of millions. Now, here's the uncomfortable question that some lawyers and financial advisors would later whisper about. If Bruce still held shares in that company, who inherited them? Were they divided equally among 5 children, as Bruce had always promised, according to friends who heard him speak? Or did Michael, the son who had built the empire, receive a larger share? And if he did, was that Bruce's true wish, or was it the result of that mysterious meeting in mid-April, if such a meeting truly changed anything? The disease had stolen Bruce's voice, but had it also stolen his children's trust in each other, as some family friends wondered? Had someone used those final 7 days, when their father was at his weakest, to rewrite the family's future? And if so, who decided that one child's contribution was worth more than a lifetime of love from the others? For 38 years, she made him tea. 3 sugars, milk added first, steeped for exactly 4 minutes, because Bruce Allpress was particular about his tea. Let's call her Marion, the kind of woman who becomes invisible in a household, the one who sees everything but is rarely asked what she knows. She was the housekeeper, the companion, the woman who arrived at 8 o'clock every morning and often stayed until the last child went home at night. And according to sources familiar with the household, Marion saw everything in those final weeks. What she allegedly witnessed, if the accounts are true, would shatter the carefully constructed image of a peaceful, unified family farewell. Marion started working for Bruce in 1982, when he was rebuilding life as a single father after his marriage had ended. 5 children, the youngest still in school, and a father who was drowning in grief and work. Marion became the steady presence, friends of the family recall. She cooked meals, she reminded Bruce about parent-teacher conferences, she ironed his costumes for theater performances. Over nearly 4 decades, she became something more than an employee. She became, in her own quiet way, part of the family fabric. Or so people thought. According to someone who claims to have spoken with Marion after Bruce's death, and this person insists Marion wasn't seeking money or attention, but simply couldn't sleep at night, she described the final 2 weeks of Bruce's life in detail that is both heartbreaking and disturbing. The first sign that something was allegedly wrong came around early April 2020. Bruce had been declining for months, yes, but his mental state had been relatively stable. He recognized his children, he smiled when his grandchildren visited, he still watched his favorite films, The Quiet Earth, Utu, the director's cut of The Two Towers, where his scene with Bernard Hill hadn't been shortened. But in early April, something allegedly changed. Marion supposedly arrived to find Bruce in a state of agitation. He was trying to speak, struggling to form words around the paralysis that had claimed his throat muscles. She leaned in close, the way she'd learned to do, trying to understand. And what she heard, or thought she heard, made her blood run cold. He was saying one word, over and over. Not. 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 Not what? She asked him, according to the account. What's wrong, Bruce? He couldn't explain, the story goes. The frustration in his eyes was unbearable. Marion allegedly called for one of the children. Sources won't say which one,
but whispers suggest it was Anna, who lived closest and visited most frequently. Anna arrived within 20 minutes, the account continues. She went into her father's bedroom alone.
When she emerged 15 minutes later, Marion supposedly noticed Anna's face was set in an expression she'd never seen before. Hard, almost angry. Anna allegedly told Marion that her father was fine, just confused from the medication. She said the doctor would be adjusting his prescriptions. Then she said something that reportedly still echoes in Marion's memory, if this conversation happened. Bruce needs rest. We need to limit visitors for a few days. Just immediate family. Marion had never been excluded before, according to those familiar with the household. In 38 years, through illnesses and family dramas and holidays, she'd always been welcome, trusted. But now, suddenly, she was being asked to step back, or so the story goes. Just for a few days, Anna allegedly assured her. Just until he stabilizes. Those few days became a week, sources claim. Marion was told to come only in the mornings, to prepare meals and leave them in the refrigerator. She wasn't to disturb Bruce. She wasn't to go into his bedroom. When she asked about his condition, she received vague answers, according to the account. He's sleeping a lot. He's comfortable. The hospice nurse is managing his care. But Marion knew that house better than anyone, friends say. She knew which floorboards creaked. She knew the rhythm of that household. And what she allegedly heard on the morning around mid-April, when neighbors recall seeing a professional-looking visitor, told her that something was very, very wrong, if her account is accurate. She'd arrived early that morning, according to the story, because she'd forgotten to prepare Bruce's favorite soup the night before. She let herself in quietly, not wanting to wake anyone. That's when she supposedly heard voices from the bedroom, not the soft murmurs of family comfort. Sharp voices, tense. One of them was unfamiliar, possibly a lawyer, someone Marion had met once before, years ago, when Bruce had updated his will after purchasing the shares in Michael's coffee business, or so she believed. She couldn't hear everything, the account suggests, but she heard enough. A male voice, saying something about guiding his hand, about motor control being almost gone. And then another voice, one of the children, allegedly responding that he understands, that he nodded when asked, that he knows what this means. Did he? Did Bruce truly understand? According to Marion's supposed recollection, shared with someone she trusted, she had seen him the previous week, before the restrictions began. The man she'd known for 38 years had been slipping away, not from the disease alone, but from something else. Heavy sedation, she suspected. His eyes had been glassy, unfocused. When she'd ask him if he wanted chicken soup or pumpkin soup for dinner, he'd stared at her as if she were a stranger, or so she claimed. Marion allegedly didn't confront anyone that morning. She quietly finished preparing the soup, left it in the refrigerator with reheating instructions, and went home. But that night, according to the account, she called Susan, the eldest daughter. Susan, who had always been the peacekeeper, the one who tried to hold the family together. Marion supposedly asked her a simple question. Did you know there was a visitor at the house today? There was allegedly a long silence. Then Susan said, or so Marion claimed, No, I didn't know. Who told you that? Marion explained what she'd heard, the story goes. And then Susan supposedly said something that revealed just how fractured this family had become. She allegedly said, Marion, I need you to do something for me. I need you to write down everything you remember from these past 2 weeks. Every conversation. Every detail. And don't tell anyone else you're doing this. Why? Marion reportedly asked. Because, Susan allegedly said, I think my father is being manipulated, and I need proof before it's too late. If this conversation happened, it was already too late. Bruce Allpress died 6 days later, and by then, whatever he'd allegedly signed was legally binding, witnesses claim. The deed, as they say, was done. According to sources, Marion did write everything down, 8 pages in her careful handwriting, dated and signed each page, sent copies to Susan and to Peter, the youngest son, who had also allegedly been excluded from that mid-April meeting. And then she waited for the family to confront the truth, to demand answers, to challenge whatever had been done to their father in his final helpless days. But the confrontation never came, sources say.
at least not publicly. What happened instead was silence. A cold, terrible silence that allegedly fell over the Allpress family like a burial shroud. Susan stopped returning Marion's calls, according to the account.
Peter sent a brief message, thanking her for her service and informing her that the family no longer required her assistance. After 38 years, Marion was dismissed, or so the story goes. No farewell, no acknowledgement of nearly 4 decades of devotion. She attended the funeral, witnesses confirm, standing at the back of the crematorium chapel. She watched the 5 children deliver their eulogies, each one speaking beautifully about their father's legacy. She watched Michael speak about how Bruce had believed in him when no one else did, how that early investment in Allpress Espresso had been an act of faith that changed his life. She watched Anna read a poem about letting go. She watched Susan, Peter, and Jane stand together, their faces composed, their grief private. And she wondered, according to those who spoke with her, did they know? Did Susan and Peter and Jane know what had allegedly been done? Or were they, like Marion, left on the outside of a decision that had already been made, a deal that had already been sealed, if such a deal existed? The will was read in private, as is customary. Its contents were not made public. In New Zealand, unlike some jurisdictions, estate matters remain confidential unless someone files a legal challenge, and no challenge was ever filed publicly. Which means either all 5 children were satisfied with their father's final wishes, or some of them decided that fighting would destroy what little remained of their family bonds, as some observers speculated. Marion, now in her 70s according to estimates, lives quietly. She never married, never had children of her own, friends say. The Allpress family was her family. And now, if the accounts are true, she sits in her quiet flat, holding those 8 pages of handwritten testimony, and she asks herself the same question every day. Should she have fought harder? Should she have called the other children earlier, before mid-April, when Bruce could still make his wishes clearly known? Should she have refused to leave when they told her to step back? But the question that allegedly haunts her most is this. In those final moments, when Bruce was saying no, 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 was he trying to warn her about what was coming? Was he trying to tell her that something was being done against his will? And if she'd understood, if she'd acted faster, could she have saved the Allpress family from tearing itself apart?
There's an old saying in New Zealand theater circles, never cross Bruce Allpress, because he'll remember. Not with vengeance, but with a quiet withdrawal of warmth that somehow felt worse than anger. Bruce wasn't a vengeful man, colleagues recall, but he was a man of principle. He believed in fairness, in equity, in treating people with the respect they'd earned. Which is why what allegedly happened in the months before his death, a systematic, deliberate campaign to erase certain voices from his final chapter, if the rumors are true, feels so utterly contrary to everything he stood for. Unless, of course, it wasn't his campaign at all. Unless someone else was writing the script, and Bruce, trapped in a failing body, was merely the unwilling star. To understand what may have happened in those final 7 days, you have to go back further. Back to 2018, when Bruce first received the diagnosis, whatever it was. He was 88 years old, still sharp, still stubborn, still insisting he could perform in the Takapuna Repertory's production of Waiting for Godot, despite the tremor that had started in his left hand. The diagnosis devastated him, friends recall, but it also galvanized him. He wanted his affairs in order. He wanted clarity. He wanted to ensure that his 5 children would be provided for, and more importantly, that they would know he loved them equally. According to sources who claim to have been present for family discussions in late 2018, Bruce made his intentions crystal clear. The house in Auckland, purchased in 1967 and now worth more than 2 million New Zealand dollars, would be sold and the proceeds divided 5 ways. His shares in Allpress Espresso, which by then represented significant value, would also be divided equally, or so he told people. There were some personal bequests. His theater awards would go to Susan, who'd followed him into acting. His collection of rare New Zealand films would go to Peter, who worked as an archivist. Specific jewelry pieces for Jane and Anna. But the bulk of the estate, the real wealth, would be split with mathematical precision, friends recall him saying. 1/5 each. Fair. Equal. Final. Bruce even joked about it, according to witnesses.
During a family dinner in December 2018, attended by all 5 children, plus several grandchildren, he allegedly raised his glass and said, "When I'm gone, you'll each get exactly the same. So there's no point fighting over who was my favorite. You all were. You all are." But by April 2020, something had allegedly changed. And if you trace the timeline carefully, if you look at who benefited and who lost power, a disturbing pattern emerges, or so some observers claim. It starts with proximity. In early 2020, as Bruce's condition worsened and the world entered pandemic lockdown, caring for him became a full-time responsibility. Susan and Jane, who both lived outside Auckland, found it increasingly difficult to visit. Peter, who worked in Wellington, was essentially cut off by travel restrictions. That left 2 children physically close to their father, Anna, who lived in Takapuna, and Michael, whose coffee roastery was in Westmere, just 20 minutes away. At first, this seemed natural, friends observed, practical. Anna and Michael became the primary caregivers, coordinating with the housekeeper and the visiting hospice nurses. They handled medications, doctor's appointments, financial matters. They kept the other siblings informed through group messages. Everything seemed collaborative, loving even. But then the messages allegedly started to change. According to claims later shared with a family mediator, this detail comes from a source who says they saw mediation documents, the updates became less frequent, less detailed. When Susan asked specific questions about their father's pain management or cognitive state, the responses were vague, the source claims. He's stable. He's comfortable. The doctors are handling it. In late March 2020, Susan allegedly tried to arrange a video call with her father, just to see his face, to tell him she loved him. Anna responded that Bruce was too tired for calls, that the effort of focusing on a screen exhausted him, according to Susan's later account. Susan accepted this. She didn't want to burden her dying father. But here's what she didn't know, according to sources. Michael was visiting every single day, bringing food from the coffee shop, sitting by Bruce's bed, having long conversations that the hospice nurses later allegedly described as intense and private. What were they discussing? Business, presumably. The coffee company that Bruce had helped birth, that bore the family name, that had grown beyond anyone's wildest projections. Here's where the story takes a darker turn, if the whispers are accurate. In early April, Michael allegedly approached a lawyer, not the family's longtime solicitor, a woman who'd handled Bruce's legal affairs for 2 decades, according to sources. No, Michael went to someone new, a specialist in estate planning and business succession, or so the rumors suggest. Why the change? Michael later claimed, according to one version of events, that the previous lawyer was unavailable, busy with other clients. But some sources tell a different story. The longtime solicitor had allegedly reached out to the Allpress family in March 2020, offering to review Bruce's will and ensure it reflected his current wishes. She received no response, or so one account suggests. The new lawyer, meanwhile, allegedly did receive a response. According to unconfirmed claims, he met with Michael multiple times in 1 week. Early April, mid-April. Each meeting lasting over an hour. And then, around mid-April, a lawyer visited Bruce at home, or so neighbors recall. Now, this is where we enter the realm of legal complexity and ethical ambiguity. New Zealand law allows people to change their wills at any time, as long as they have mental capacity and aren't being unduly influenced. But how do you prove capacity when someone can barely speak? How do you prove the absence of undue influence when the person allegedly benefiting from the change is the one providing care, controlling access, managing the dying person's entire environment? The document that Bruce may have signed that day, or that someone guided his hand to sign, depending on which version you believe, allegedly made significant changes. Not to everything, according to sources familiar with rumored contents. The house would still be sold and divided, the personal bequests remained intact. But the shares in Allpress Espresso? Those, according to whispers from people who claim to know, went entirely to Michael. The justification, as supposedly explained in the document, was that Michael had built the business, that he'd earned those shares through decades of work, that Bruce wanted to ensure the company remained in the hands of someone who understood it. On the surface, this might seem reasonable, even fair, from a certain perspective. Michael had turned a small investment into a fortune. He'd honored the family name, employed dozens of people, created something lasting. Why shouldn't he inherit the shares, if that's what Bruce truly wanted? But here's what allegedly tears at the fabric of this family. Bruce had never, ever suggested such an arrangement before, according to multiple friends. In all the conversations from 2018 and 2019, when his mind was clear and his voice was strong, he had insisted on equal division, they claim. He had told his daughters they deserved just as much as his sons. He had told Peter, the youngest, that blood mattered more than business. So what happened between December 2018, when Bruce toasted to equality, according to witnesses, and April 2020, when he allegedly signed away millions to one child? Did he truly change his mind? Did he decide, in his final weeks, that fairness meant something different than he'd always believed? Or did someone with daily access and enormous financial incentive, convince a dying man to alter his legacy? If any of this is true. The other 4 children will never know for certain, sources suggest. They weren't in the room. They didn't hear what was said, what promises were made, what arguments were presented to their fading father. All they know is that the man who raised them to believe in fairness allegedly left them a final message that felt profoundly unfair. And they have to live with the possibility that it wasn't really his message at all, if the rumors hold any truth. Some families would fight. They'd hire lawyers, challenge the will, demand investigations into mental capacity and undue influence. They'd air every bitter grievance in court, let strangers judge their family's most intimate moments. But the Allpress children didn't fight publicly. Perhaps because they knew their father would have hated that. Perhaps because some battles, even when you're right, cost more than they're worth. Or perhaps because, according to some who claim to know, the child who allegedly benefited most made it very clear, through lawyers and carefully worded letters, that any challenge would result in a protracted legal war that would consume the entire estate in fees and destroy the family completely. A scorched earth promise that silence was the only way to preserve anything at all, if such threats were ever made.
So they chose silence, observers note. They attended the funeral, delivered their eulogies, embraced each other with what witnesses described as the stiffness of strangers. They divided the house proceeds as promised, 5 equal shares, exactly as the original will had stipulated. They took their personal bequests and went their separate ways. But in that silence, in the space where questions should have been answered and grievances should have been heard, something precious died along with Bruce Allpress, or so some family friends believe. Trust died. The belief that family means treating each other with honesty and fairness, that died too. And the 5 children who once gathered around their father's dinner table, laughing and bickering and belonging to each other, became 5 separate people, united only by DNA and a shared suspicion that they'd been betrayed, if the whispered accounts hold any water. Michael still runs Allpress Espresso. The business thrives. You can drink their coffee in cafes from Auckland to Amsterdam, never knowing that every cup is brewed with beans from a company built on a father's faith, and possibly, just possibly, entangled in a story darker than anyone wants to admit. Anna maintains, according to those who know her, that everything was done properly, that Bruce knew exactly what he was signing, that she has nothing to apologize for. She doesn't speak to Susan or Peter anymore, some say. The silence is easier than the accusations. Susan tried, for a while, to get answers, sources claim. She hired a lawyer to review the situation, to check if there were grounds for a challenge. The lawyer allegedly told her the truth. Maybe, but it would take years and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and there's no guarantee you'd win. Sometimes the only victory is walking away. Peter has written something, rumors suggest, unpublished, sitting in a drawer somewhere in Wellington. In it, reportedly, he describes those final 7 days in detail. The phone calls that allegedly went unanswered, the messages that went ignored, the feeling of being deliberately excluded from his own father's death. Some say publishers have seen it, called it powerful but legally problematic. Translation: too much truth, not enough protection. And Jane? Jane, the middle child who always tried to make peace, who believed family was sacred, she moved to Australia in late 2020, according to public records.
She doesn't come back for holidays, friends say. When asked about her father, she says kind things. She talks about his artistry, his warmth, his love of Shakespeare. She doesn't talk about the will. She doesn't talk about what may have been stolen in those 7 days when a good man's voice was taken and someone else's words might have been put in its place. The question isn't whether Bruce Allpress loved his children. He did. Every single one of them. The question is, did he choose to love one more? Or did someone choose for him? And in a family where fairness was supposed to be sacred, where a father's word was supposed to be law, who decided that some children deserved everything, while others got only the crumbs? If anyone decided at all. Those 7 days in April 2020 will allegedly haunt the Allpress family forever. Not because of what was said, but because of what couldn't be said. Because Bruce Allpress, the man who made audiences weep with a single glance, who commanded stages and screens with his presence, spent his final week unable to command even his own fate. Or so the darkest version of this story suggests. And someone, somewhere, may have decided that was the perfect time to rewrite his story. Who benefits when a dying man can't speak for himself? Who profits when confusion is mistaken for consent? And when 5 children gather around their father's grave, knowing that one of them might have stolen from the others? Knowing that the truth died with him? How do they ever forgive? How do they ever forget? These are the questions that linger, unanswered, in the silence after Bruce Allpress took his final breath. But perhaps the deepest mystery surrounding Bruce Allpress's final days has nothing to do with lawyers or legal documents, and everything to do with something far older than New Zealand law. Something that, according to those who knew him intimately, Bruce believed in with a conviction that bordered on obsession. He was, despite his rational theatrical training and his Cambridge education, profoundly superstitious. And in his final week, the one object that had supposedly protected him for nearly 40 years vanished without explanation. Some say it was stolen. Others whisper it was taken as payment. But those who saw Bruce's face in those final hours, before speech left him entirely, claim he knew exactly what its disappearance meant. He knew his time had come. The object was a ring.
Not a wedding band, which Bruce had stopped wearing after his divorce in 1981. This was something else entirely. A heavy silver ring with a greenstone setting, carved in the traditional Maori style, though Bruce himself had no Maori ancestry, according to family records. He'd acquired it in 1979, during the filming of a television drama in Rotorua. The story, as Bruce told it to close friends over the years, was both strange and unsettling. He'd been shooting night scenes near Lake Rotorua, working 16-hour days in the cold and damp. On the 3rd night of filming, he'd felt violently ill, struck by what he assumed was food poisoning or flu. The production nurse wanted to send him to hospital, but an elderly Maori woman who worked as a cultural advisor on set allegedly pulled him aside. According to Bruce's later account, she told him he was being affected by the location itself, by spirits who didn't want the story being told. She gave him the ring, insisting he wear it on his right hand and never remove it. Bruce, delirious with fever and desperate to continue working, did as she asked. Within hours, he felt better. Coincidence, he initially thought, but then strange things kept happening, or so he claimed. Equipment malfunctions would occur when he wasn't wearing the ring. He'd forget lines he'd known perfectly, only to remember them the moment he touched the greenstone. After filming wrapped, he tried to return the ring to the woman who'd given it to him, but no one on the production could recall anyone matching her description. The cultural advisor listed in the credits was a man, and when contacted, he insisted he'd worked alone. From that point forward, Bruce never took the ring off, friends and colleagues confirm. He wore it through every performance, every filming, every family gathering. When asked about it, he joked that it was his good luck charm, but those closest to him knew it was more than that. It was, in Bruce's private belief system,
The reason he'd survived 6 decades in a brutal industry. The reason he'd never been in a serious accident, despite countless dangerous stunts. The reason he'd reached 89 years old when so many of his contemporaries had died young. Here's where the story becomes deeply troubling, if the accounts are accurate. In mid-April 2020, approximately 1 week before Bruce's death, a hospice nurse named Rachel allegedly noticed something unusual during her evening visit.
She was checking Bruce's vital signs, adjusting his position to prevent bed sores, when she noticed his right hand. The ring was gone. In its place was a pale band of skin that hadn't seen sunlight in 41 years. Rachel, according to sources familiar with her account, asked Anna, who was present that evening, where the ring had gone. Anna allegedly responded that it had become too loose, that Bruce's weight loss from the illness meant the ring kept sliding off his finger, so they'd removed it for safekeeping. This explanation seemed reasonable enough. Rachel made a note in her records and continued her duties. But later that night, according to a statement Rachel allegedly made to a friend, something bothered her about the exchange. Bruce's hands were swollen from fluid retention, a common symptom in his condition. His fingers were larger than usual, not smaller. A ring that had fit for 41 years shouldn't suddenly be too loose. If anything, it should have been tighter, possibly even requiring removal by a jeweler. Rachel reportedly mentioned this inconsistency to the night shift nurse who relieved her. That nurse allegedly decided to check on it during her shift. Around 2 a.m, when the house was quiet and Anna had gone home, she gently asked Bruce, who was awake but barely responsive, about the ring. Bruce's reaction, as described in notes that the nurse supposedly shared with a supervisor, was immediate and distressing. His eyes widened. He tried to lift his hand, the paralysis making the gesture jerky and painful to watch. And he made a sound, a guttural attempt at speech that the nurse interpreted as no or gone. She tried to comfort him, telling him the ring was safe, that his family had it. But Bruce became more agitated, sources claim. His heart rate increased. His breathing became labored. The nurse had to administer additional medication to calm him. And as the sedatives took effect, she allegedly heard him whisper one word with heartbreaking clarity. The word was stolen. When Anna arrived the next morning, the nurse reportedly asked her directly about the ring's location. Anna allegedly became defensive, according to the account. She said it was a family matter, that the ring was in a safe place, that Bruce had agreed to its removal. But when pressed about why Bruce seemed so distressed, Anna supposedly ended the conversation abruptly, stating that the nurses needed to focus on medical care, not jewelry. The ring was never seen again, according to sources who later asked about it. It wasn't among Bruce's personal effects returned to the family after his death. It wasn't mentioned in the will or estate inventory. None of the 5 children claimed to have it, though some allegedly accused others of taking it. And when Susan, months after the funeral, reportedly hired a private investigator to trace valuable items that had gone missing from her father's house, the investigator came back with a disturbing possibility. The ring, if it had been sold, would have been worth somewhere between 8,000 and 15,000 New Zealand dollars, according to expert appraisers who examined photographs. Greenstone of that quality and age, with documented provenance, commands premium prices among collectors. The investigator allegedly found records of a similar ring sold through a private Auckland estate dealer in late April 2020. The seller's identity was protected by confidentiality agreements. The buyer was reportedly an overseas collector. But the timing, just days after Bruce's death, raised questions that have never been satisfactorily answered, sources say. Why would someone sell a dying man's most treasured possession? If the ring truly had been removed for safekeeping, why wasn't it returned to Bruce's hand for burial, as he'd surely have wanted? And if one of the children took it, either for sentimental reasons or financial gain, why deny it? Why let their father die believing his protection had been stolen from him? But here's the part of the story that allegedly keeps some family members awake at night. 3 days after the ring disappeared, Bruce's condition deteriorated rapidly, according to medical records that sources claim to have reviewed. He'd been stable, relatively speaking, for weeks. The progression of his illness had been slow, giving the family time to prepare, time to say goodbye. But once that ring was gone, everything accelerated. Within 72 hours, he'd lost the ability to swallow. His breathing became so labored that continuous oxygen was required. And his lucid moments, which had been frequent enough for simple communication, became rare and brief.
The hospice staff noted the sudden decline with professional detachment, observers say. Sometimes they wrote, "The body simply surrenders." Sometimes there's no medical explanation for why one patient lingers for months while another fades in days.
But Rachel, the nurse who'd first noticed the missing ring, allegedly told a colleague something that was never put in any official record. She said, "He didn't surrender. He gave up. He believed his protection was gone, and so he stopped fighting." Was the ring's disappearance a betrayal? A theft in the cruelest sense? Taking not just an object, but a dying man's faith that he was safe? Or was it, as one of the children supposedly claimed in a private conversation, an act of mercy? A way to release Bruce from his superstitions, to let him go without fear, without clinging to magical thinking in his final hours? The answer depends on whether you believe the person who took it had Bruce's best interests at heart or their own. What's undeniable is this. Bruce Allpress spent 41 years believing that ring kept him alive, and the moment it vanished, he began to die in earnest. Coincidence? Medical inevitability? Or did someone in that house, someone with access to a helpless man, decide that his beliefs didn't matter anymore, that practical concerns outweighed his psychological need for protection? And if they'd take his ring while he was powerless to stop them, what else might they have taken? If any of this is true, what other acts might they have committed, justified by the belief that the end result mattered more than the method? The missing ring was only the beginning, according to sources who've pieced together the fractured accounts from multiple witnesses. Because while the Allpress family was allegedly fracturing over legal documents and estate shares, something far more personal and devastating was unfolding. A betrayal so complete, so calculated, that it would forever poison the memory of Bruce's final days for those who eventually learned the truth. And the betrayer wasn't a stranger, wasn't a predatory lawyer or opportunistic caregiver. It was someone Bruce had trusted absolutely, someone who'd shared his dinner table for decades, someone who'd promised to protect the family's secrets, and instead allegedly sold them to the highest bidder. Let's call this person James, not his real name, because naming him publicly would invite lawsuits this story can't afford. But James was real, and his relationship to Bruce was as close as blood without being blood. He'd been Bruce's closest friend for nearly 30 years, a fellow actor who'd starred alongside him in countless productions, from the Takapuna repertory to television New Zealand dramas. They'd celebrated birthdays together, mourned losses together, shared the intimate details of their lives in the way that only old friends can. Bruce trusted James with everything, friends recall. Financial advice, family problems, health concerns. When Bruce's marriage ended in 1981, James had been the one who helped him navigate the loneliness, the shame, the fear of losing his children's respect. When Bruce received his devastating diagnosis in 2018, James was among the first to know. And when Bruce began planning his estate, making decisions about who would inherit what, James allegedly served as a sounding board, a trusted advisor who had no financial stake in the outcome. Or so Bruce believed. According to sources who claim to have seen bank records and communication logs that later emerged during a private family investigation, James had been in serious financial trouble since at least 2017. His acting work had dried up, the roles going to younger performers. He'd made poor investments, lost money in a failed business venture, accumulated debts that were approaching 6 figures in New Zealand dollars. By early 2020, he was allegedly facing bankruptcy. And that's when, sources suggest, he made a choice that would haunt him and devastate the Allpress family. He started recording his conversations with Bruce. Not all of them, according to what investigators later pieced together. Just the interesting ones. The conversations where Bruce talked about his children, about family tensions, about his concerns that some of his kids were more interested in his money than his welfare. The conversations where Bruce, perhaps confused by medication or simply seeking comfort in familiar company, said things he'd never say in front of his children. Complaints, disappointments, fears about what would happen to the family after he was gone. James allegedly captured it all on a small digital recorder, according to sources. And then, in early April 2020, he approached a journalist. Not a tabloid reporter, sources clarify, but a respected writer working on a book about New Zealand entertainment history.
James offered exclusive material on Bruce Allpress, intimate details no one else could provide. The price, according to claims that later emerged, was 3,500 New Zealand dollars, approximately 1,800 British pounds.
About 2,200 American dollars at the time. $3,500. That was apparently the value of 3 decades of friendship, if the allegations are true. That was what James's loyalty cost. The journalist, to his credit, according to some accounts, was allegedly uncomfortable with the arrangement. Something about James's demeanor, the desperation in his pitch, raised ethical red flags. But James was persuasive, sources claim. He framed it as preserving Bruce's legacy, as ensuring the real man would be remembered, not just the public persona. He promised the material would only be used after Bruce's death, when privacy concerns would be less acute. The journalist apparently agreed, paid half up front, and waited for the recordings. But here's what James allegedly didn't know. One of Bruce's children had become suspicious of James's frequent visits in Bruce's final weeks. Sources won't say which one, but whispers point to Peter, the archivist, who understood document trails and information security. Not because of any obvious signs of treachery, but simply because the visit seemed oddly timed. James would arrive when other family members had just left. He'd ask the nurses for privacy. He'd emerge from Bruce's room looking shaken, but also strangely energized. Peter allegedly asked one of the hospice nurses to pay attention to what happened during these visits. The nurse, bound by professional ethics, but also deeply fond of Bruce, agreed to stay within earshot. And on one particular afternoon in mid-April, she heard something that made her blood turn cold, according to later testimony she supposedly provided to the family. She heard Bruce's voice, weak and slurred, saying something about Michael, about the business, about feeling pressured. And then she heard James's voice, unnaturally loud and clear, saying, "So you feel like Michael is taking advantage of your condition? Is that right, Bruce? Can you tell me more about that?" The phrasing struck her as wrong, sources say. It wasn't how friends talk to each other. It was how interviewers talk to subjects, leading questions designed to elicit quotable responses. She quietly moved closer to the partially open door and glimpsed James holding his mobile phone at an angle that suggested recording. The nurse immediately informed Peter, according to the account. Peter allegedly confronted James that same day, though accounts of what transpired differ wildly. One version has Peter physically removing James from the house, threatening legal action if he ever returned. Another version suggests a tense negotiation where James denied everything, claimed he was just making voice notes to help remember Bruce's stories for a potential eulogy. But the damage, if the recordings existed, had already been done. James had allegedly captured hours of material over several weeks. Bruce talking about Anna's controlling behavior, or so he supposedly said. Bruce expressing confusion about legal documents he couldn't remember signing. Bruce wondering aloud if he could still change his will, if it was too late to fix mistakes he'd made. All of it recorded. All of it potentially sold to a journalist who was building a narrative about a beloved actor's troubled final days. Peter allegedly tried to track down the journalist to stop publication or at least hear what James had provided. But the journalist, according to sources, refused to reveal his source or confirm whether any such recordings existed. Journalistic ethics, he reportedly claimed, prevented him from discussing unpublished material. Peter threatened legal action. The journalist responded that truth was a complete defense against defamation, and if Bruce's own words were captured on record, there was no legal basis to suppress them. The stalemate continued for months, observers note. No book was published, no article appeared. But the mere existence of those recordings, if they're real, has allegedly created a permanent schism in the relationship between the Allpress children and anyone who was close to their father in his final weeks. Because if James could betray Bruce for $3,500, who else might have been recording, documenting, preparing to profit from an old man's helpless vulnerability? And here's the cruelest twist, according to those familiar with the aftermath. James attended Bruce's funeral. He sat in the fourth row of the chapel, wept openly during the eulogies, and approached each of the 5 children afterward to offer his condolences. He told them their father had been his dearest friend. He said Bruce's loss had left a hole in his life that could never be filled. And when Peter allegedly confronted him,
quietly, away from the other mourners, asking how he could live with what he'd done. James supposedly responded with words that have been repeated among family members like a curse.
He allegedly said, "I preserved his truth when all of you were trying to rewrite it. Someday you'll thank me." No one has thanked him, sources confirm. James moved to Wellington shortly after the funeral, according to public records. His financial situation apparently improved, though the source of his recovery remains unclear. Some speculate the journalist paid the remainder of the fee. Others suggest James sold the recordings elsewhere, perhaps to an overseas publication or documentary maker. The truth, like so many aspects of Bruce's final days, remains hidden behind denials and destroyed evidence. But the betrayal itself, whether or not the recordings ever surface, has done its damage. The Allpress children can never know for certain what their father said in those unguarded moments, according to those close to the family. They can never know if his complaints were real, or just the confused rambling of a dying, medicated brain. They can never know if their father genuinely felt manipulated and betrayed, or if James's leading questions planted ideas that weren't there. And that uncertainty, that permanent doubt about their father's true feelings in his final days, is perhaps the cruelest theft of all. Because James didn't just steal Bruce's words. He stole his children's ability to remember him clearly, to trust their own memories of his love, to believe that the man who raised them died at peace with how they'd cared for him. If those recordings exist, they're a time bomb. If they don't, the mere rumor of their existence has already accomplished what truth could never do. It's made every child wonder if they were the one their father complained about, the one who failed him when he needed them most. Who betrays a dying friend for money? Who records a confused man's private pain and sells it as entertainment? And when that friend is gone, unable to clarify or correct or forgive, how does the betrayer sleep at night? If James truly did what some allege. These are questions that linger, unanswered, in the wreckage of what was once an unshakable friendship. And somewhere, allegedly, on a hard drive or in a cloud storage account, Bruce Allpress' final honest words wait to be released, to confirm or destroy what remains of his family's fragile peace. But the ring and the recordings, devastating as they were, paled in comparison to what investigators allegedly discovered when they finally gained access to Bruce's financial records in the months following his death. Because somewhere between his diagnosis in late 2018 and his death in April 2020, a substantial fortune simply vanished. Not the house, which was accounted for. Not the Allpress Espresso shares, which, however unfairly distributed, were at least documented. But everything else. The accumulated wealth from 60 years of steady work. The careful savings of a man who'd lived through harder times and never forgot the value of money. The investments and bonds and cash reserves that should have made Bruce's estate worth millions. Gone. Evaporated. And when the children finally understood the scale of what had been taken, they faced an impossible choice: pursue justice and expose their family's shame to the world, or remain silent and let the thief win. Bruce Allpress wasn't wealthy by celebrity standards, friends are quick to clarify. He'd never commanded Hollywood salaries, never negotiated back-end points on blockbuster films, but he'd worked continuously from the 1950s through 2019, a rare feat in any actor's career. Steady television work, theater productions, voice work for radio dramas and later animated series, commercial endorsements, teaching fees from workshops. It all added up. And Bruce, shaped by Depression-era values, despite being too young to remember the 30s clearly, saved relentlessly. Friends recall his frugality bordering on stinginess in certain areas. He drove the same Toyota for 22 years, according to vehicle records. He bought clothes from second-hand shops, even when he could afford new. He split dinner bills down to the exact dollar, never offering to pay for others unless it was a special occasion. This wasn't poverty or even ordinary thrift, acquaintances observed. It was a deliberate philosophy. Save now so your children won't struggle later. By 2018, according to financial advisors who allegedly reviewed his portfolio during estate planning sessions,
Bruce had accumulated approximately 1.4 million New Zealand dollars in liquid assets, separate from his property and business investments. This included savings accounts, term deposits, a modest share portfolio beyond Allpress Espresso, bonds, and a small collection of gold coins he'd purchased in the 1970s when inflation fears were high. 1.4 million.
Not a fortune, but enough to ensure his children would each inherit a meaningful sum, even after the house and business shares were distributed. That figure was confirmed in documents Bruce signed in December 2018, sources claim. His longtime solicitor had prepared a comprehensive estate inventory, reviewed it with Bruce, and filed copies with both the Law Society and Bruce's bank as part of standard wealth protection protocols. 1.4 million in cash and equivalents. Documented, witnessed, legally binding. But when Susan, acting as interim executor, finally gained access to Bruce's financial records in May 2020, over a month after his death, delayed by lockdown complications and legal wrangling over executor appointments, she discovered accounts that told a very different story, according to sources familiar with her findings. The savings accounts held less than $23,000 combined. The term deposits had been closed in March 2020, penalties paid for early withdrawal. The share portfolio had been liquidated in February. The bonds cashed in January. The gold coins were missing entirely, their safety deposit box emptied in late 2019. 1.4 million had been reduced to 23,000 in approximately 16 months. Over 98% of Bruce's liquid wealth had vanished while he was dying, allegedly unable to understand what was being done in his name. Susan's first assumption, she later told a family mediator, according to sources, was bank error or identity theft. She contacted the bank's fraud department, provided death certificates and executor documentation, demanded a full investigation. The bank complied, conducting what they described as a thorough review. Their findings, delivered in a formal letter that allegedly still sits in Susan's possession, were both clear and devastating. Every transaction had been legitimate, the bank reportedly concluded. Every withdrawal had been authorized by Bruce's power of attorney, which had been activated in January 2020 when his physical condition made it impossible for him to visit bank branches in person. The power of attorney was a legal document, properly executed, witnessed by a solicitor, and filed with all appropriate institutions.
The person holding that power of attorney had every legal right to access Bruce's accounts, move his money, make investment decisions on his behalf. The person holding power of attorney was Anna. Anna, the devoted daughter who'd cared for Bruce daily in his final months. Anna who'd coordinated his medical care, managed his household, protected him from stress and visitors who might upset him. Anna who had allegedly told her siblings that their father's affairs were in order, that everything was being handled properly, that they needn't worry about financial details while Bruce was dying. Anna who, according to bank records, had systematically emptied every account she could access, transferring the money to destinations that financial investigators would later find nearly impossible to trace. When Susan confronted her, according to multiple sources who claimed to know about the meeting, Anna's response was calm, detailed, and, at least on the surface, entirely reasonable. She explained that Bruce's medical care in his final year had been extraordinarily expensive. The hospice care was partially covered by public health services, yes, but there were gaps. Private nursing for overnight shifts when the pain was worst, specialized equipment for mobility and breathing, medications not funded by Pharmac, dietary supplements and nutritional formulas, physical therapy to maintain comfort and prevent complications. And Anna allegedly emphasized efforts to maintain Bruce's dignity and quality of life in ways that the public system simply couldn't provide. She had receipts, sources say, invoices for medical equipment, payment records for private nurses, pharmacy bills, all legitimate, all necessary, or at least defensible as necessary. Anna claimed the care had cost approximately $270,000 over 16 months, a staggering sum, but one that seemed plausible for end-of-life care at the highest level. But $270,000, even if accurate, didn't explain the disappearance of 1.4 million, Susan pointed out, according to accounts of the confrontation. Where was the rest? Where was the remaining 1.1 million that should still have been in accounts or investments? Anna's answer to this allegedly shifted. First, she claimed there were other expenses she hadn't documented as carefully. Legal fees for updating the will and power of attorney, she supposedly said. property maintenance on the Auckland house, which Bruce had been obsessive about maintaining, gifts to grandchildren that Bruce had wanted to give before he died, seeing them enjoy his generosity rather than waiting for an inheritance, tax liabilities that had to be settled, debts to friends that Bruce wanted repaid honorably. The numbers were vague, Susan allegedly noted. The explanations kept changing. And when Susan asked for a complete accounting, a detailed spreadsheet showing every dollar of the $1.4 million and where it had gone, Anna became defensive, according to sources. She said she'd been caring for their dying father, not running a bookkeeping service. She said if Susan didn't trust her, that was Susan's problem, not hers. She said Bruce had wanted his final months to be comfortable, and that's what she'd provided. And if it cost more than expected, at least he died in peace. Susan, acting on advice from a solicitor, allegedly gave Anna 30 days to provide full documentation, according to the account. Anna missed the deadline. When pressed, she produced partial records that sources say raised more questions than they answered. Invoices from companies that couldn't be verified, payments to individuals whose identities were protected by privacy claims, transfers to accounts Anna described as medical services, but which appeared in banking records as simple personal transfers, no merchant codes, no business identification. The pattern, according to forensic accountants that Susan allegedly hired at considerable personal expense, suggested something far darker than medical expenses. It suggested systematic theft disguised as caregiving costs, money taken from a helpless man, justified by the claim it was for his own benefit, but actually diverted to purposes that had nothing to do with Bruce's comfort or care. Specifically, investigators allegedly found that approximately $420,000 had been transferred to accounts in Anna's name, not to medical providers, not to equipment suppliers, not to nursing agencies, directly to Anna. She claimed these were reimbursements for expenses she'd paid out of pocket, according to sources. But she couldn't produce receipts showing $420,000 in personal spending on Bruce's care. She could show perhaps $30,000 or $40,000, which indeed seemed like reasonable out-of-pocket expenses for a primary caregiver.
The remaining $380,000 had no explanation that held up under scrutiny, sources familiar with the investigation claim. It had simply moved from Bruce's accounts to Anna's accounts, transferred in increments over 15 months, always below the threshold that would trigger automatic reporting to tax authorities. And the gold coins? The modest collection Bruce had treasured, not for monetary value but for sentimental reasons, each one purchased to mark a significant event in his life? Anna claimed she didn't know where they were, according to sources. She suggested Bruce might have sold them years ago, or given them away, or perhaps they'd never existed in the quantities he'd claimed. But Susan had photographs of Bruce with his coin collection, taken as recently as 2017. She had insurance documents listing each coin, with valuations totaling approximately $48,000. Those coins had been in a safety deposit box that required 2 keys, one held by the bank, one held by Bruce. After Bruce became incapacitated, his personal keys had been in Anna's possession, sources note. The safety deposit box was accessed in November 2019, according to bank records. It was emptied completely. The coins were never seen again, and Anna's explanation, that Bruce had asked her to liquidate them for medical expenses, couldn't be verified because Bruce by that point could barely communicate at all. What Susan and the other siblings eventually came to suspect, according to sources close to the family, was that Anna had been planning this for years. Not necessarily with malicious intent, some tried to believe, but with a sense of entitlement born from being the primary caregiver. Anna had sacrificed her own career, her own social life, her own comfort to care for their father. Perhaps in her mind, she deserved compensation beyond what a simple inheritance division would provide. Perhaps she convinced herself that Bruce would have wanted her to have more, that her labor and devotion had earned her a larger share. Or perhaps, and this is the darkest interpretation that some family members have reluctantly accepted, Anna saw an opportunity and took it. A dying father, isolated by pandemic restrictions, unable to monitor his own finances, completely dependent on her for every aspect of his existence. A power of attorney that gave her legal access to everything he owned.
Siblings who trusted her, who believed she was acting in their father's best interests, who never thought to verify her claims until it was far too late. By the time Susan discovered the full scope of what had allegedly happened, Bruce had been dead for over a year. The legal window for challenging certain transactions had closed. Anna had consulted lawyers who'd apparently structured everything carefully, ensuring that most of her actions, while morally questionable, were technically legal under the broad powers granted by the power of attorney document. Pursuing criminal charges would require proving criminal intent, prosecutors reportedly told the family when Susan approached them. But Anna had receipts for some expenses, plausible explanations for others, and the defense that she'd been acting under the enormous stress of caring for a dying parent during a global pandemic. Any jury would be sympathetic, prosecutors allegedly suggested. And even if charges were filed, the legal process would take years, cost hundreds of thousands in legal fees, and tear the family apart in public view. The civil route was equally discouraging, sources say. Susan could sue Anna for breach of fiduciary duty, for conversion of assets, for unjust enrichment. But Anna had already spent much of the money, allegedly on a home renovation and a new vehicle and investments that couldn't be easily liquidated. Winning a judgment was possible, lawyers told Susan, but collecting it could take decades of enforcement actions, liens, and bankruptcy proceedings that would yield pennies on the dollar. So Susan faced the same impossible choice that victims of family financial abuse often face: destroy the family to pursue justice, or accept the loss to preserve what little relationship remains. She chose with deep bitterness, according to those who know her, to let it go. Not to forgive, but to accept that some battles can't be won, that some thieves will never face consequences, that sometimes the person who steals from you is protected by the very love and trust that made the theft possible. The other children made similar choices, sources suggest. Michael, already enriched by the Allpress espresso shares, perhaps felt less entitled to fight. Peter, overwhelmed by the complexity and emotional toll, withdrew entirely. Jane moved to Australia and tried to forget. But the money is still gone, observers note.
$1.4 million that Bruce Allpress saved over 60 years of work, intending to leave his children secure, to give them a foundation, to show them in death what he'd tried to show them in life, that he loved them all, that he'd provided for them equally. Gone. Taken by the one child who had the access, the opportunity, and allegedly the ruthlessness to betray her father's trust when he was most vulnerable. And Anna? Anna lives in Auckland, sources say, in a renovated home in a desirable neighborhood. She drives a late-model European vehicle. She posts occasionally on social media about family memories, about how much she misses her father, about the privilege of caring for him in his final days. She never mentions the missing money. She never acknowledges her siblings' accusations. And perhaps, in her own mind, she's convinced herself that everything she did was justified, that she deserves every dollar she took, that her father would have wanted her to have it, if only he'd been capable of saying so. But Bruce never said so, according to every document he signed when his mind was clear. He wanted equality. He wanted fairness. He wanted his children to share his modest wealth as they'd shared his love. And someone, allegedly the one he trusted most to honor those wishes, decided she knew better, decided her needs mattered more, decided that a dying man's stated intentions could be ignored, rewritten, erased, if the person with the power was willing to act while he was helpless to stop them. What does it profit someone to gain hundreds of thousands of dollars if the cost is their family's respect, their siblings' trust, their father's legacy? And when the money is spent and the years pass and the isolation becomes unbearable, will Anna finally admit what she allegedly did? Or will she take that secret to her own grave, leaving her siblings to wonder forever whether their father died knowing he'd been robbed, or whether Anna at least had the mercy to keep him ignorant of her betrayal until the very end? According to sources who later questioned the official account, only 5 people allegedly knew the complete truth about what happened in Bruce Allpress's bedroom during those final 72 hours before his voice disappeared entirely. Not all 5 children, sources claim. 3 of them had allegedly been deliberately excluded from the most critical moments, according to those who later pieced together the timeline.
No, this was a different group of 5, bound together by professional duty and something darker that some would later call complicity. There was Anna, of course, the daughter who controlled access to her father like a fortress gate. There was the new solicitor, the estate specialist, whose name appeared on documents but never in family conversations. There was Dr. Patterson, the palliative care physician who made house calls that weren't recorded in the official hospice logs, or so claims suggest. There was a private nurse whose employment records mysteriously vanished from the agency that supposedly sent her. And there was one more, someone whose identity remains protected by legal threats even now, but whose role in what transpired may have been the most crucial of all. Together, these 5 allegedly orchestrated what can only be described as the systematic erasure of Bruce Allpress's final autonomy, and they allegedly did it with such professional precision that proving wrongdoing became nearly impossible for the children who felt left behind. Dr. Patterson had been Bruce's physician for less than 3 months when the end came, according to medical transfer records that Susan later obtained through formal requests. This struck multiple family members as strange, given that Bruce had been seeing the same general practitioner for over 20 years, a woman named Dr. Chen, who knew his medical history intimately, who'd guided him through his initial diagnosis, who'd coordinated his hospice referral and pain management protocols. But in early February of 2020, Anna allegedly informed her siblings that Dr. Chen was no longer available, that she'd referred Bruce to a specialist who had more experience with his particular condition. Dr. Patterson was indeed a specialist, sources confirm, but his specialty raised questions that weren't asked until far too late. He focused on end-of-life care for patients with cognitive impairment, dementia, Alzheimer's disease, conditions where capacity and consent became legal minefields. Why would a patient with a purely physical illness, one that theoretically left the mind intact, need such a specialist? Anna's explanation, according to emails reviewed by investigators, was that Bruce had developed anxiety and confusion secondary to his illness, that he needed someone who understood the psychological aspects of dying.
But Dr. Patterson's role, as later evidence suggested, went far beyond psychological comfort. According to pharmacy records that Susan eventually subpoenaed during her private investigation, Dr. Patterson prescribed medications in Bruce's final 8 weeks that significantly exceeded standard palliative protocols. Lorazepam, a powerful anti-anxiety medication that causes sedation and memory impairment. Haloperidol, an antipsychotic typically reserved for patients with severe agitation or psychosis. Morphine, in doses that some palliative care experts later called aggressive for someone not in acute crisis. And most troubling, according to sources who reviewed the records, these prescriptions increased dramatically in mid-April, during the exact week when the mysterious legal visitor came to the house and documents were allegedly signed. A hospice nurse who worked with Bruce in March, before being told her services were no longer required, later told investigators something that she'd found deeply disturbing at the time, but hadn't known how to report, sources claim. She said that during one of her final visits, she'd questioned a medication dosage that seemed excessive for Bruce's apparent pain level. Dr. Patterson, who happened to be present that day, allegedly told her that the medications weren't just for pain, they were for agitation management. But the nurse saw no agitation, she reportedly insisted. Bruce was calm, even cheerful that morning, trying to joke with her despite his limited speech. Dr. Patterson supposedly responded with words that the nurse never forgot. He allegedly said, "We need to keep him comfortable and prevent outbursts that could be distressing for the family. The family has requested that we maintain a calm environment." When the nurse pressed him, asking specifically what outbursts he meant, Dr. Patterson reportedly ended the conversation by suggesting that she focus on her assigned duties and leave medical decisions to the physician. She was replaced by a private nurse within 48 hours, according to employment records. That private nurse, the one whose records later disappeared, became part of the inner circle, sources suggest. She worked 12-hour shifts, overnight periods when Anna wasn't present, but when sensitive activities apparently needed to occur.
Neighbors recall seeing her arrive around 8 in the evening and leave at 8 in the morning, a schedule that continued for approximately 3 weeks leading up to Bruce's final deterioration. But when Susan tried to locate this nurse after Bruce's death, hoping to understand his final days more clearly, she hit a wall. The nursing agency Anna had supposedly hired her through had no record of sending anyone to the Allpress residence during that period, according to investigators. The name Anna provided, Jennifer Matheson, appeared in no nursing registries in New Zealand. The phone number went to a disconnected line. The address on paperwork Anna produced led to a vacant lot. Either Jennifer Matheson never existed, investigators concluded, or someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to erase her trail after Bruce's death. What did this phantom nurse do during those overnight hours?
What medical procedures or legal formalities required a nursing presence outside official hospice care? And why would someone capable enough to provide end-of-life care need their identity scrubbed so thoroughly afterward, unless they'd participated in something that wouldn't survive professional scrutiny? The solicitor, at least, was real and traceable, though getting him to answer questions proved nearly impossible due to attorney-client privilege claims. His name was Richard Thornhill, a partner at a mid-sized Auckland firm specializing in estate disputes and asset protection. Interesting choice, some observers noted, for someone supposedly just updating a dying man's will. Estate disputes are what you hire Thornhill to win, not to prevent. Asset protection is what you need when you're worried someone might challenge your inheritance. Why would Anna engage this particular type of lawyer unless she anticipated conflict? Thornhill visited the Allpress home at least twice in April 2020, according to neighbors who kept informal watch on the comings and goings during lockdown when unusual visitors stood out. His car, a distinctive dark blue Audi that one neighbor remembered because it blocked her driveway, was parked outside the house on 2 separate occasions, roughly 1 week apart. The first visit lasted approximately 40 minutes. The second visit, the one that occurred around mid-April when only Anna and Michael were present, lasted over 2 hours. What does an estate lawyer do for 2 hours at a dying man's bedside?
Review documents, presumably. Explain changes and their implications. Ensure the client understands what they're signing, can articulate their wishes, demonstrates the mental capacity required for valid legal execution. But if Bruce could barely speak, if his communication was reduced to blinks and slight nods, as witnesses described, how thorough could that capacity assessment possibly be? And if Dr. Patterson had prescribed sedating medications that would cloud judgment and impair memory, how could Thornhill ethically certify that Bruce knew what he was doing? These questions were never answered publicly, because Thornhill refused all requests for information beyond confirming that he'd provided legal services to Bruce Allpress and that all appropriate protocols were followed. When pressed by lawyers representing other family members, he allegedly responded that his client's confidentiality survived death and that the will's validity spoke for itself. If anyone wanted to challenge it, they knew where to find him, in court. The 5th member of this alleged conspiracy remains unnamed in all accounts, protected by legal agreements that sources claim included substantial non-disclosure payments. But whispers within the family suggest this person was an accountant or financial advisor, someone with the technical expertise to move money, restructure assets, create paper trails that would withstand basic scrutiny while hiding the true flow of wealth. This person allegedly worked with Anna in the months before Bruce's death to reposition his liquid assets in ways that would minimize estate taxes while maximizing Anna's access and control. If this person existed, they were very good at their work. The financial investigation Susan commissioned found transfers that were perfectly legal, structured through legitimate instruments, documented with appropriate authorizations. Nothing obviously criminal, nothing that screamed theft to casual examination. But when analyzed as a pattern, when traced through their cumulative effect, the transfers told a story of systematic wealth extraction from a vulnerable person who almost certainly didn't understand what was happening to his life savings. Together, these 5 people, Anna, Dr. Patterson, Phantom Nurse Jennifer, Solicitor Thornhill, and the unnamed financial expert, allegedly formed a circle of complicity that made challenging what happened to Bruce nearly impossible, according to those who tried. Each person had plausible deniability for their individual role. The doctor was managing a patient's comfort. The nurse was providing care. The lawyer was executing client instructions. The financial advisor was implementing estate planning. And Anna was simply coordinating it all as a devoted daughter protecting her father's interests and privacy. But when you step back and view their actions collectively, when you see how each person's role supported and enabled the others, when you notice how they all benefited, either financially or professionally, from keeping Bruce sedated, isolated, and unable to communicate with family members who might question what was happening, a darker picture emerges. A picture of 5 people who allegedly understood that they had a limited window of opportunity, perhaps only weeks or days, to accomplish something that couldn't happen if Bruce regained clarity or if the excluded children gained access. They moved in concert, sources suggest, with timing that seems too precise to be coincidental. The medication increases came just before the legal visits.
The legal visits happened when specific family members were conveniently absent. The financial transfers processed during periods when Bruce was most sedated. And throughout it all, Anna maintained her role as gatekeeper, deciding who could see her father and when, controlling the flow of information to her siblings, presenting herself as the selfless caregiver while allegedly orchestrating the greatest betrayal of Bruce's life. Did these 5 people explicitly conspire, meeting in secret to plan their approach? Or did they simply fall into complementary roles, each pursuing their own interests, while recognizing that the other's cooperation made everything easier? The answer may determine whether what happened was criminal conspiracy or merely unethical opportunism. But for Bruce's excluded children, the distinction hardly matters. Their father died surrounded not by family who loved him equally, but by a carefully selected group who had reasons to want him quiet, compliant, and gone before questions could be asked. And the most haunting aspect, according to those who've studied the timeline, is how quickly this group dissolved after Bruce's death. Dr. Patterson stopped treating the family immediately, referring them back to Dr. Chen for any death certificate questions. Nurse Jennifer vanished without trace. Thornhill went silent behind privilege claims.
The financial advisor, if they exist, never surfaced publicly, and Anna was left holding everything they'd accomplished together: the reformed will, the depleted accounts, the restructured assets, with no one willing to testify about how it all came to be. A perfect crime, some call it, if crime it was. A seamless operation where everyone got what they wanted except the man whose money and autonomy were allegedly stolen while he lay helpless in his own bed. How do you prove conspiracy when the conspirators were professional enough to hide behind legitimate roles? How do you challenge a will when the people who witnessed its signing claim everything was proper? And how do you live with the knowledge that your father's final days were controlled not by love, but by a coordinated effort to extract everything he'd saved before his time ran out? 3 weeks after Bruce Allpress' ashes were scattered in the Hauraki Gulf, his favorite sailing waters from younger, stronger years, a package arrived at Susan's home in Wellington. No return address, posted from an Auckland mailbox according to the postmark, wrapped in plain brown paper and sealed with excessive tape that suggested whoever sent it didn't want it opened accidentally. Inside was a journal, its leather cover worn soft with handling, pages filled with Bruce's distinctive handwriting that slanted slightly left, a quirk from childhood education that he'd never corrected. Susan recognized it immediately as one of the notebooks her father had kept for decades, recording thoughts and observations that he'd sometimes mined for character development or teaching material. But this particular journal shouldn't have existed, according to everything Susan knew about her father's habits and health timeline. The dates on the entries ran from January through early April of 2020, months when Bruce supposedly could barely hold a pen, when his motor control had deteriorated so severely that writing should have been impossible. Yet here was page after page of text, shaky and difficult to read in places, but unmistakably his words. And what those words revealed, if authentic, was evidence of a mind that remained sharp and aware far longer than Anna had told her siblings. Evidence that Bruce understood exactly what was being done to him. Evidence that he tried, desperately, to leave a record of the truth before his ability to write disappeared completely. And evidence that pointed directly at who was manipulating him, who was stealing from him, and what he wanted his children to know after his death. The journal began ordinarily enough, entries from January discussing the progression of his illness with the same wry humor Bruce had always brought to difficulty. He wrote about frustration with his weakening hands, about the indignity of needing help with basic tasks, about missing the stage and the particular electricity that came from live performance. He mentioned visits from his children, expressing gratitude for Michael's daily stops and Anna's tireless caregiving. Nothing in these early entries suggested paranoia or confusion, just a dying man processing his situation with remarkable clarity and grace. But the tone shifted dramatically in late February, according to the entry Susan read with growing horror. Bruce began noting things that worried him. Medications he didn't remember agreeing to, conversations he apparently had no recollection of, though Anna insisted they discussed important matters just hours earlier. Periods of time that went missing from his memory, gaps of several hours where he couldn't account for what had happened or who had visited. He wrote, in an entry dated February 27th, "Something is wrong with my mind, or something is being done to my mind. I cannot tell which is worse." March brought entries that were increasingly difficult to read.
the handwriting deteriorating as his physical condition worsened, but the content became more specific and more damning if the journal was genuine. Bruce wrote about discovering that his longtime doctor had been replaced without his clear consent, that a new physician named Patterson had taken over his care. He noted that this Dr. Patterson asked strange questions about his children, about his will, about whether he felt some had contributed more to his life than others. Bruce wrote on March 8, "Why does my doctor care about inheritance? This is not medical. This is something else." On March 15th, Bruce apparently attempted to call his solicitor, the longtime lawyer who'd handled his affairs for 20 years. He recorded that he asked Anna to place the call, explaining he wanted to review his will and ensure everything was as he'd intended. According to the journal entry, Anna became upset, insisted his will was fine, told him he didn't need to worry about such matters while he was ill.
When Bruce persisted, she allegedly said the solicitor was unavailable, unreachable, had retired, perhaps. The story kept changing. Bruce wrote, "She is lying to me. My own daughter is lying. Why?" The entries from late March were fragmentary, sometimes just a few words scrawled with obvious effort. But they tracked a pattern of increasing isolation and medication. Bruce noted being given pills he didn't recognize. He recorded feeling foggy, unable to think clearly, sleeping 12 or 14 hours at a stretch. He wrote about asking to see Susan and being told she was too busy, about requesting video calls with his grandchildren and being assured they'd be arranged, but then never happening. On March 28th, he managed to write, "They are keeping me away from everyone. Anna and Michael. Why do they need me alone?" April brought the most disturbing entries, if Susan's later account to a family mediator is accurate. Bruce's handwriting became almost illegible, letters wandering off the line, words incomplete. But the fear in those final pages was palpable. On April 4th, he wrote what might have been, "Papers to sign today. Don't understand them. Too tired to read carefully. Anna says trust her. Should I?" 3 days later, another entry. "Sign something. They guided my hand. Lawyer was there. Not my lawyer. Who was he? What did I sign? Tried to ask questions, but words wouldn't come. They said just nod, just agree, just trust. I don't trust, but can't stop them." April 10th, in handwriting so shaky it took Susan hours to decipher, according to sources. "Ring is gone. They took my protection. I am going to die soon. I know this. I want to die. But not like this. Not with lies. Not with theft. My children. Not all of you. Some of you. You know who you are. You are killing me slowly and taking everything. I forgive you because I am too tired to hate. But God will not forgive. Truth will not forgive." The final entry that was even marginally readable came on April 13th, just 10 days before Bruce's death. 7 words, heavily underlined, the pen tearing through the paper in places with the force of his pressure. "They are stealing my voice and my fortune." After that, blank pages. Either Bruce lost the ability to write, or someone discovered the journal and prevented further entries. But the fact that the journal existed at all, that it eventually reached Susan months after his death, suggested that Bruce had hidden it successfully, that whoever sent it had found it somewhere in the house and understood its importance. Susan immediately consulted with a forensic document examiner, sources report, someone who could verify whether the handwriting was genuinely her father's or an elaborate forgery designed to stir family conflict. The examiner compared the journal entries to known samples of Bruce's writing from various periods of his life. His conclusion, according to sources who saw the report, the handwriting was consistent with Bruce Allpress's style, showing natural variation and deterioration consistent with progressive neuromuscular disease. The paper and ink were appropriate for the claimed time period. There were no signs of artificial aging or obvious forgery techniques. In the examiner's professional opinion, the journal was authentic. But authenticity created as many problems as it solved.
If the journal was real, it provided powerful evidence that Bruce had been mentally competent far later than Anna claimed, that he'd understood what was happening to him, that the documents he signed in mid-April were executed under duress or diminished capacity caused by excessive medication. It could be grounds to challenge the will, to investigate Anna's financial activities as elder abuse, potentially even to pursue criminal charges. Yet using the journal meant exposing their family's darkest secrets to legal proceedings and public scrutiny. It meant Susan testifying that her sister had allegedly drugged and manipulated their dying father. It meant Michael facing questions about whether he'd participated in or benefited from Bruce's coerced consent to will changes. It meant every painful detail becoming court record, media fodder, permanent stain on Bruce Allpress's public legacy. Susan agonized over this decision for weeks, according to friends who supported her through the process. She consulted lawyers, therapists, family mediators. Some urged her to fight, to use the journal as evidence and pursue justice regardless of cost. Others counseled acceptance, arguing that Bruce himself had written he forgave his betrayers, that perhaps honoring his exhaustion and desire for peace meant letting go rather than waging war.
What ultimately stopped Susan from moving forward, sources suggest, was a conversation with a barrister who specialized in estate litigation. He reviewed the journal carefully, acknowledged its evidential value, but then explained the brutal reality of how such cases unfold. The journal would be challenged by Anna's lawyers as the confused ramblings of a dying man on heavy medication, its accuracy questioned, its interpretation disputed. Dr. Patterson would testify that Bruce suffered from delirium and paranoia, common in terminal illness. The new solicitor would insist all proper protocols were followed. And most devastatingly, the barrister said, "You will spend 2 to 3 years in court, perhaps $200,000 in legal fees, enduring cross-examination about every family argument and resentment from the past 60 years, all for perhaps a 30 to 40% chance of winning any meaningful remedy. And even if you win, your sister will likely declare bankruptcy, making collection nearly impossible. Is that outcome worth destroying what remains of your family?" Susan decided it wasn't, according to those close to her. She locked the journal in a safe deposit box, kept copies in secure locations, but took no legal action. She did, however, send photocopies to her siblings, all of them, including Anna and Michael. She included a note that reportedly said simply, "Dad left this for us to find. He wanted us to know the truth. What we do with that truth is now our choice. I choose to remember him as he was before the end, and to live the rest of my life knowing exactly who I can trust." Anna's response to receiving the journal, if she sent one, has never been disclosed. Michael allegedly called Susan once, a conversation she later described to friends as tense and circular, with him insisting the journal proved only that their father had been confused and paranoid from medication, exactly as expected in his condition. Peter sent Susan a letter thanking her for the truth, expressing that it confirmed everything he'd suspected but couldn't prove. Jane never responded at all, sources say, but she did increase her distance from certain family members, declining invitations to gatherings where Anna would be present. The journal remains in Susan's possession, a time bomb of truth that could still detonate if circumstances changed, if new evidence emerged, if statute of limitations allowed future action. But more than legal evidence, it serves as a devastating personal document for Bruce's children who loved him, because it proves he knew. He wasn't oblivious or too far gone to understand. He watched his autonomy being stolen, his wishes being overridden, his money being taken, and he was powerless to stop it, except to write words that might surface after his death. Some might argue the journal brings closure, that knowing Bruce remained mentally sharp is a comfort, evidence that the father they loved was still present behind the failing body. But for Susan and those who believed him, the journal made everything worse, because it transformed Bruce's death from a medical inevitability into a conscious experience of betrayal. It meant he died knowing his daughter had lied to him, that his son had benefited from his coercion, that people he trusted had conspired to take everything while he watched helplessly. It meant his final weeks were not just physically agonizing, but emotionally devastating, spent in awareness that love had been replaced by greed. And perhaps cruelest of all, the journal revealed that Bruce forgave them. Not because he believed they deserved forgiveness,
but because he was too exhausted to sustain anger, too close to death to waste his remaining energy on hate. He forgave them, and then he died, leaving his children who weren't complicit to carry the rage and grief he'd laid down. Is that forgiveness noble, or is it abandonment? Did Bruce free himself from bitterness, or did he trap his honest children in fury that will never find resolution? The journal entries haunt those who've read them, sources report. The image of Bruce struggling to hold a pen, fighting through medication-induced fog to record truth, knowing these might be his final coherent thoughts, and choosing to use them not for poetry or wisdom, but for documentation of theft. It's unbearable for those who loved him. And the fact that he hid the journal successfully, that it reached Susan despite whatever efforts might have been made to prevent such evidence from surviving, suggests Bruce had moments of clarity and cunning even at the end. He played weak and compliant, while secretly preserving testimony that could destroy his betrayers if his children chose to wield it. But they haven't wielded it, observers note. The journal exists, but stays silent, locked away like the family's shame. And Anna lives free, unindicted, unpunished except by whatever conscience she possesses.
She knows the journal exists now. She knows her father documented her betrayal in his own hand. And she has to wonder, every single day, whether today is the day Susan changes her mind, files the lawsuit, makes the journal public record. That uncertainty, some say, is the only justice Bruce's betrayers will ever face. The permanent possibility that their crimes might yet be exposed, that their victims might yet decide silence costs more than truth. Do you let a dying man's written testimony stay hidden to preserve family peace? Or do you honor his effort to record the truth by using his words as weapons against those who wronged him? And if Bruce himself said he forgave them, does that forgiveness bind his children too? Or does each generation have the right to seek justice the previous one was too exhausted to pursue? For nearly 2 years after Bruce Allpress's death, Marion kept her silence. The housekeeper who'd served him for 38 years, who'd been dismissed so abruptly in his final days, who'd written 8 pages of testimony about what she'd witnessed, she told no one beyond Susan and Peter about what she knew. She attended the funeral, mourned privately, and tried to move forward with her life in a quiet flat in Mount Eden, where neighbors knew her only as a polite elderly woman who kept to herself. But silence has weight, friends say. It accumulates like snow on a roof, until one day the structure can't bear it anymore, and everything collapses. For Marion, that collapse came in early 2022, when she read an interview in a New Zealand lifestyle magazine celebrating Anna Allpress as a devoted caregiver who'd sacrificed everything to give her father a peaceful death at home. The article was framed as inspiration for families facing similar end-of-life decisions, according to those who read it. Anna spoke beautifully about the challenges of caregiving, the emotional toll, the privilege of being present for her father's final breath. She talked about managing his complex medical needs, coordinating hospice services, ensuring his comfort and dignity. She mentioned the support of her siblings, the collaborative family approach, the shared grief that had brought them closer together. She said that despite the hardship, she'd do it all again without hesitation, because that's what love requires.
The article included a photograph of Anna in Bruce's former home, which had since been sold, proceeds divided as promised, standing next to his theater awards and holding his favorite script. She looked serene, dignified, the picture of filial devotion. Readers wrote comments praising her sacrifice, calling her a role model, expressing hope they'd have such a loving daughter when their time came. Marion read the article 3 times, sources say, each reading making her physically ill with rage and grief. Because every word Anna spoke was, in Marion's experienced eyes, a calculated lie. The peaceful death had been drugged sedation. The family collaboration had been deliberate exclusion. The privilege of presence had been gatekeeping that prevented other children from saying proper goodbyes. And Anna had the audacity to claim it all stemmed from love, when Marion had witnessed, had documented, what she believed was systematic elder abuse. Marion made a decision that day, according to accounts from the person she contacted. She reached out to a journalist, not the one who'd allegedly bought recordings from James, but an investigative reporter known for stories about elder financial abuse and family exploitation.
She said she had information about a beloved New Zealand actor's final days that the public deserved to know. She said she had documentation, dates, details, and the moral obligation to speak before more time passed and memories faded further. She said she understood this would likely result in legal threats and personal attacks, but she was 74 years old, owned nothing worth taking, and couldn't die carrying secrets that protected the guilty while dishonoring the dead. The journalist met with Marion 6 times over 3 weeks, according to sources familiar with the process. He reviewed her 8 pages of handwritten testimony, cross-referenced dates with other evidence he'd gathered independently, interviewed neighbors who recalled the unusual visitors during Bruce's final weeks, consulted with medical experts about the medications and their cognitive effects. He approached the story carefully, aware that defaming the living carried legal consequences, but also believing that elder abuse thrived in silence and respectable appearances. He also, ethically, contacted Anna before publication to offer her opportunity to respond to the allegations.
This is where the story takes another turn, because Anna didn't deny the core facts, according to sources who reviewed correspondence. She acknowledged that Marion had been asked to reduce her hours, that Bruce's care had become more intensive and required professional nursing. She confirmed that Dr. Patterson had taken over medical management, that legal documents were reviewed and updated, that financial matters were handled according to proper power of attorney protocols. She even acknowledged that some siblings had limited access during the final weeks, attributing it to pandemic restrictions and Bruce's fluctuating capacity for visitors. What Anna denied was intent. She insisted every decision was made in Bruce's best interest, with his comfort and dignity as the sole priority. She characterized Marion's allegations as the bitter resentment of an employee who'd been replaced by qualified medical professionals and couldn't accept that her role had become unnecessary. She threatened legal action if the article portrayed her as anything other than a devoted daughter who'd honored her father's final wishes. The journalist faced a decision, sources say. He had Marion's testimony, which was detailed and credible, but ultimately one person's interpretation of events she'd witnessed peripherally. He had neighbors' accounts of unusual visitors, but nothing definitively nefarious about lawyers and doctors visiting a dying man. He had expert opinions that the medication regimen was aggressive, but doctors could argue it was appropriate for Bruce's specific symptoms. He had no access to the journal Susan possessed, as she'd refused to share it publicly. And he had Anna's flat denial and threat of litigation if he proceeded. After consulting with his publication's legal team, the journalist made what some call a compromise and others call a capitulation. He wrote a story about challenges families face in end-of-life care, using Bruce Allpress's death as a case study, but framing it as complex and disputed rather than clearly abusive. He included Marion's concerns anonymously, balanced against Anna's explanation. He raised questions about medication management and access control, but stopped short of accusations. The article's headline read, "When Caregiving Becomes Control, the Blurred Lines in Elder Care," and it ran in a major metropolitan newspaper in April of 2022. Marion was devastated, according to friends. This wasn't what she'd risked her reputation to expose. The article made it sound like a philosophical debate about caregiving ethics, not a documented case of a daughter drugging and stealing from her helpless father. The specifics she'd provided, the dates, the excluded siblings, the financial transfers, were either softened or omitted entirely. Anna came across as perhaps overzealous, but fundamentally well-meaning. The truth Marion had carried for 2 years emerged into daylight so filtered and diluted that it changed nothing. But the article did accomplish something Marion hadn't anticipated. It brought other people forward, sources claim. A second hospice nurse, who'd also been replaced suddenly, contacted the journalist with similar concerns about medication management and isolation. A neighbor who'd found the nighttime comings and goings suspicious offered security camera footage showing the frequency of late-night visits from the phantom nurse Jennifer. And most significantly, a former employee of solicitor Richard Thornhill's firm reached out with information that suggested the will changes had been discussed and drafted weeks before Bruce allegedly signed them, raising questions about whether the document was truly responsive to Bruce's final wishes, or rather prepared in advance, awaiting only a signature from a man too compromised to read what he was authorizing. The journalist began investigating a follow-up piece, this time with multiple sources and harder evidence. But before he could publish, something happened that shut down the investigation entirely. Marion received a legal letter, sources report, from Thornhill's firm representing Anna.
The letter alleged that Marion had violated confidentiality agreements signed during her employment, that her allegations constituted defamation, and that if she continued speaking publicly, she'd face civil litigation, seeking damages for harm to Anna's reputation and emotional distress. The confidentiality agreement Marion had allegedly signed was from 1997, according to sources, a standard household employment contract that included a clause about not discussing family private matters. Marion barely remembered signing it, but the law firm had a copy, and their letter made clear they'd enforce it aggressively.
Marion had no savings to hire her own lawyer, no resources to fight a prolonged legal battle against a well-funded firm defending a woman who'd allegedly stolen hundreds of thousands from her own father. The journalist's publication also received legal warnings, sources say. Not direct threats, but communications from media lawyers representing Anna, pointing out potential defamation issues, requesting correction of factual errors in the first article, suggesting that continued pursuit of unproven allegations might result in expensive litigation. The publication's management, weighing the cost of legal defense against the public interest value of a story about a 2-year-old death with no criminal charges filed, decided to drop the follow-up investigation. Marion was silenced again, observers note. But this time she'd gone public. Her voice was on record, even if muted, and people who loved Bruce knew that someone beyond family had tried to speak for him. The journalist maintained his notes and sources, keeping them secure in case circumstances changed and legal barriers dropped. The second nurse kept her concerns documented. The neighbor preserved security footage, all of it waiting for a moment when truth might be safer to tell. That moment hasn't come yet, sources suggest. Anna continues her life, her reputation intact among those who don't know the deeper story, her inheritance secure unless legal challenges emerge. Marion lives quietly, disappointed but not entirely defeated, knowing she tried, even if she failed to achieve justice. And Bruce's children remain divided, some believing Marion's account absolutely, others dismissing it as the exaggerations of a woman bitter about losing employment, most simply exhausted by the endless questions that can never be definitively answered. But Marion gave one more interview, sources claim, after the legal threats quieted her public voice. She spoke to a documentary filmmaker working on a project about elder abuse in New Zealand, someone who could protect her identity and whose work wouldn't be released for years, long after the legal risks had diminished. In that interview, Marion allegedly said something that summarizes the entire tragedy of Bruce Allpress's final days. She said, "I worked for that man for 38 years. I knew when he was happy and when he was sad, when he was pretending to be fine and when he was genuinely content." In those final weeks, before they pushed me out, I saw in his eyes what he couldn't say with his mouth. He was afraid. Not of dying. He'd made peace with that. He was afraid of what was being done to him, of who was doing it, and of the fact that no one with power to stop it would believe him. That's what I can't forgive. Not the money they took, or the will they changed, or even the ring they stole. I can't forgive that they made him die afraid and unable to tell anyone why. Do you trust the people who control your voice when you can no longer speak? Do you believe your protectors will honor your wishes when protecting you is no longer profitable or convenient? And when someone witnesses your mistreatment but lacks the power or resources to stop it, is their testimony worth anything at all? Or does justice only come to those who can afford lawyers skilled enough to weaponize the truth? The documentary filmmaker who interviewed Marion promised her footage would remain sealed until enough time had passed that legal threats lost their power. But sometimes, truth finds other paths to daylight, carried by people who stumble across it accidentally and can't unsee what they've learned. In late 2021, approximately 18 months after Bruce's death, a conveyancing lawyer named Sarah Michaels was processing the sale of the Allpress family home on Auckland's North Shore when she discovered something that should never have existed in the property file. It was a document dated March 9th, 2020, more than 6 weeks before Bruce allegedly signed the revised will that gave Michael the Allpress Espresso shares. But this earlier document, bearing Bruce's signature and witnessed by his longtime solicitor, explicitly stated that all assets, including business holdings, were to be divided equally among his 5 children. The signature was strong, clear,
utterly unlike the shaky scrawl on the April documents. And someone had tried to remove this version from official records, failed, and left a paper trail that proved the April signing wasn't a change of heart, but a replacement of his true wishes. Sarah Michaels had worked in property law for 19 years, long enough to recognize when documents didn't align properly. The March will was filed correctly, stamped by the solicitor's office, registered with the appropriate authorities. It was legally binding and clear in its intentions.
But then, in late April, after Bruce's death, a second version appeared in the probate file. Same basic structure, same personal bequests, but the crucial clause about Allpress espresso shares had been altered to designate Michael as sole inheritor. Both documents carried signatures, purportedly from Bruce Allpress. Both had witnessed attestations, but only one could be his genuine final testament. Sarah contacted the Law Society, as professional ethics required when document irregularities suggested fraud. An investigator examined both wills, compared signatures, checked filing dates, and witness credentials. The findings, according to sources who later reviewed the case file, were damning for whoever had submitted the April version. The March will had been signed when Bruce still possessed reasonable motor control, creating a signature consistent with his established pattern. The April will's signature showed characteristics of a guided hand, someone physically supporting Bruce's fingers around the pen, moving his hand through the motions while he lacked strength to resist, or possibly even awareness of what he was signing. Moreover, the witnesses on the March document were Bruce's longtime solicitor and her legal secretary, both credible professionals with no financial interest in the outcome. The witnesses on the April document were Richard Thornhill and someone identified as Jennifer Matheson, the phantom nurse whose existence couldn't be verified. Under New Zealand law, witnesses must be present simultaneously, must observe the testator signing voluntarily, and must themselves be identifiable and contactable. If Jennifer Matheson didn't exist, if her credentials were fabricated, then the April will lacked proper execution and was therefore invalid, regardless of whose signature appeared on it. The Law Society investigation proceeded quietly, as such matters do, but word reached Susan through the legal community's informal networks. She immediately retained a specialist in estate litigation, providing him with the journal, with Marion's testimony, with financial records showing Anna's systematic wealth extraction. Armed with the Law Society's preliminary findings about the competing wills, Susan finally had enough evidence to challenge probate formally. In November 2021, she filed an application in the High Court seeking to void the April will, validate the March will, and require a full accounting of all estate assets and expenditures from the date of Bruce's diagnosis forward. According to sources within the family, Anna allegedly claimed the March will had been superseded by Bruce's explicit instructions in April, that he'd changed his mind about the equal division after reflecting on Michael's contributions to building the coffee business. She produced letters, allegedly from Bruce to Michael, expressing gratitude and indicating intention to reward his entrepreneurial success. But forensic document examiners hired by Susan's legal team found troubling inconsistencies. The letters were typed, not handwritten, and the email metadata showed they'd been sent from Bruce's account during periods when hospice records indicated he was heavily sedated and unlikely capable of composing coherent correspondence. Someone with access to his computer and email had apparently sent messages in his name. The court proceedings dragged through 2022, accumulating costs that consumed much of the estate's remaining value. But slowly, methodically, the truth emerged through witness testimony and expert analysis. Dr. Patterson was compelled to testify about his medication protocols and admitted under cross-examination that the doses of sedatives and anti-anxiety medications in April were, in his words, at the maximum end of appropriate range and could indeed cause significant cognitive impairment. Richard Thornhill was forced to produce his file notes and billing records, which showed he'd begun drafting the revised will in mid-March, weeks before allegedly meeting Bruce to discuss his wishes. Most devastatingly, a handwriting expert testified that the April signature showed not just guided hand characteristics, but evidence of tracing. Someone had placed Bruce's limp hand over a pre-positioned template and moved it through the signature pattern. By late 2022, Anna's legal position had collapsed. Her lawyers quietly approached Susan with a settlement proposal. Anna would consent to voiding the April will and validating the March version, would provide a full accounting of her expenditures as power of attorney, and would return whatever remained of the liquid assets she'd transferred to her own accounts. In exchange, Susan and the other siblings would agree not to pursue criminal charges for fraud, forgery, or elder abuse. They would release Anna from civil liability beyond the financial restitution, and all parties would sign confidentiality agreements, preventing public discussion of the settlement terms. Susan faced another impossible choice, sources say. She could reject the settlement, push for criminal prosecution, see Anna potentially face prison time for what she'd done to their father. But criminal cases required proof beyond reasonable doubt, and Anna's lawyers would argue she genuinely believed she was acting in Bruce's interests, that any irregularities were mistakes, not crimes. The trial would take years more, cost hundreds of thousands additional, and offer no guarantee of conviction. Meanwhile, accepting the settlement meant immediate financial recovery and closure, even if it meant Anna escaped criminal consequences. After consulting with Peter and Jane, who were emotionally exhausted and financially strained by the litigation already undertaken, Susan accepted the settlement in March 2023. The April will was formally declared invalid. The March will was admitted to probate. Anna provided accounting showing she still held approximately $190,000 of the money she transferred. The rest, she claimed, had genuinely been spent on Bruce's care, though the documentation remained disputed. She transferred that sum back to the estate, which, after legal fees and costs, left roughly $120,000 to be divided among the 5 children. Combined with the house sale proceeds and the now equally divided Allpress Espresso shares, each child ultimately received their rightful inheritance, though significantly diminished from what Bruce had actually accumulated. But here's what the settlement couldn't restore: the time Bruce spent believing his children were stealing from him, the fear and betrayal he documented in his journal, the isolation he'd endured as Anna controlled who could see him and when. No court order could give the excluded children back those final conversations they'd been prevented from having. No financial restitution could repair the knowledge that their father had died surrounded by greed rather than love. And no confidentiality agreement, however strictly drafted, could erase what they now knew about each other. How do you calculate damages for stolen goodbyes?
How do you price the cost of dying afraid that your own child is betraying you? And when justice comes 3 years late and heavily compromised, does it feel like victory or just another form of loss? What the court proceedings and settlement negotiations never addressed, what remained hidden, even from the lawyers piecing together Bruce's final months, was the place he'd been taken during those last coherent weeks before sedation clouded everything permanently. Because Bruce Allpress, despite his failing body and growing awareness that something was deeply wrong in his own home, had managed one final act of defiance that Anna never discovered until it was far too late to undo. He'd convinced someone he trusted, not Marion, who'd been excluded by then, and not any of his children, whom he apparently feared were being monitored, to take him on a secret journey. Just once, for perhaps 90 minutes on a Tuesday afternoon in late March 2020, Bruce Allpress left his house without Anna's knowledge or permission, and went somewhere that held the key to understanding what he truly wanted and who he truly was. The person who helped him was named Thomas Chen, the adult son of Dr. Chen, Bruce's longtime physician who'd been replaced by Dr. Patterson. Thomas worked as a paramedic and had known Bruce casually for years through his mother's medical practice. When Dr. Chen expressed concern to her son that she'd been abruptly dismissed from Bruce's care, despite their decades-long relationship, Thomas decided to check on the old actor himself. He appeared at the house one afternoon claiming to be conducting a community health survey, a story that got him past Anna's gatekeeping because it seemed official and brief. Once alone with Bruce for a few moments, he asked a simple question: "Are you okay? Do you need help?" Bruce's response, according to Thomas's later account shared with a close friend, was to grip Thomas's wrist with surprising strength and mouth a single word: drive. Thomas understood immediately that Bruce wanted out of that house, wanted to go somewhere, needed help escaping, even if just temporarily. So Thomas told Anna he needed to take Bruce's blood pressure in a quieter location, helped him to his vehicle, and asked Bruce where he wanted to go. Bruce managed to whisper an address in Devonport, across the harbor from central Auckland, a location that meant nothing to Thomas, but clearly meant everything to Bruce. The address was a small weatherboard cottage, painted pale blue,
set back from the street behind an overgrown garden that suggested the owner either loved wildness or lacked energy for maintenance. Thomas helped Bruce to the door and knocked. An elderly woman answered, perhaps 75 or 80 years old, and her face when she saw Bruce transformed from cautious wariness to shocked joy to immediate understanding that something was terribly wrong. She said, according to Thomas, "Oh, my dear, what have they done to you?" Then she helped Thomas get Bruce inside, into a comfortable chair in a sitting room filled with books and photographs, and the particular quiet that comes